Doctor. Samuel Morrison's steady hands trembled as he pulled the surgical clamp from William Thompson's leg, his coffee-stained scrubs bearing witness to 30 years of unwavering composure. The thing emerging from the 68-year-old rancher's calf wasn't medical textbook material. It was a living nightmare that defied every principle he'd learned at Harvard Medical School. 26 inches of parasitic horror writhed in the sterile operating room lights. Nurse Rebecca Washington stumbled backward, her clipboard clattering against the tile floor as surgical instruments scattered like frightened birds. The heart monitor's steady beep became erratic, matching the collective pulse of every person witnessing the impossible extraction. In the hallway, Martha Thompson pressed weathered hands against the observation window, her great-grandmother's missing wedding ring finger trembling against the glass. She'd sold everything for this moment, never imagining it would reveal such unspeakable truth. "Lock down this room," Morrison whispered, his legendary calm finally shattered. "Call the CDC, now." What horror had been growing inside America's forgotten veterans, and how many more were silently suffering? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the Montana sky stretched endless and unforgiving over the Thompson Ranch, where William "Bill" Thompson stood mending fence posts with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through 2 tours in Vietnam. At 68, his weathered hands still knew the rhythm of honest work, even as his right leg sent shooting pains up his spine with each hammer strike. The 200-acre spread had been in Martha's family since 1923, and Bill would be damned if he'd be the generation to lose it. "A man's word is his bond," he muttered, driving another nail home with practiced precision. It was one of his father's sayings, worn smooth by decades of repetition, like the wooden handle of the hammer itself. The late afternoon sun painted the Glacier County landscape in shades of gold and amber, but Bill barely noticed the beauty anymore. These days, the ranch felt more like a burden than a blessing. Martha Thompson emerged from the farmhouse, her silver hair catching the light as she crossed the yard with 2 glasses of sweet tea. At 66, she moved with the careful grace of someone who'd spent 42 years reading her husband's moods, knowing when to speak and when to simply stand beside him. Her left hand bore the weight of her great-grandmother's wedding ring, a delicate band of rose gold that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless Montana winters. "You're favoring that leg again," she said quietly, setting the glass on a fence post within his reach. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation from someone who'd learned to notice the small things that mattered. Bill straightened slowly, feeling every one of his 68 years settle into his bones. "Been through worse in Nam, darlin'." The response came automatically, a shield against worry that he'd polished to perfection over the decades. But Martha's keen eyes caught the slight wince as he shifted his weight, the almost imperceptible pause before he reached for the tea. The ranch sprawled around them, testament to generations of Thompson family perseverance. Cattle dotted the distant pastures like dark brushstrokes against the golden grass. But Bill knew what Martha was too kind to say aloud. Their herd was smaller this year, sold off to cover mounting expenses. The drought had been merciless, and cattle prices had dropped to levels that made old-timers shake their heads and mutter about the death of the American rancher. "Tommy would have loved this sunset," Martha said softly, her voice carrying the particular ache that came with mentioning their son. Staff Sergeant Thomas Thompson had died in Fallujah in 2005, leaving behind a Purple Heart and parents who still set 3 places at the dinner table on his birthday. Bill wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, pulling her close as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. In the distance, their nearest neighbor's lights began to twinkle, reminders that even in this vast Montana landscape, they weren't entirely alone. But as the pain in his leg pulsed with each heartbeat, Bill couldn't shake the feeling that bigger challenges lay ahead. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in early March, when Bill Thompson felt what he described to Martha as little lightning bolts shooting through his right calf. He was fixing the gate latch on the north pasture, the same gate he'd repaired countless times over the past 20 years, when the sensation hit him like a live wire touching bare skin. Just old war wounds acting up, he told himself, the same explanation he'd used for every ache and pain since returning from Southeast Asia in 1972. But this felt different somehow, sharper, and more insistent than the familiar complaints of aging joints and weather-worn bones. The tingling started at his ankle and traveled upward, following no pattern he could understand or predict. Martha first noticed his slight limp during Sunday service at Glacier County Community Church. Pastor Jim McKenzie was delivering a sermon about perseverance through trials, his voice carrying easily through the small sanctuary where 3 generations of Thompsons had worshipped. But Martha's attention kept drifting to the way Bill gripped the wooden pew, his knuckles white with tension she'd never seen before. "You feeling all right, honey?" she whispered during the closing hymn. Bill's response was automatic, delivered with the practiced smile of a man who'd spent decades convincing the world he was fine. "Right as rain, Martha. Just thinking about those fence posts that need replacing." But Martha Thompson hadn't spent 4 decades married to a stubborn Marine without learning to read between the lines. That evening, she watched him pace the living room during the evening news, something he only did when his mind was wrestling with problems too big for easy solutions. When Johnny Carson came on at 11:30, Bill was still moving restlessly around the house, checking locks and adjusting thermostats with the careful attention of someone trying to avoid sitting still. The financial pressures had been building like storm clouds on the horizon all winter. The property tax notice that arrived in February carried a number that made Martha's stomach clench. $12,000 in overdue taxes, with interest and penalties that grew larger each month. The drought of the previous summer had been devastating, forcing them to sell 30 head of cattle at rock-bottom prices just to keep the lights on. Medicare covered the basics, but specialist visits required co-pays they couldn't afford. The nearest neurologist was in Billings, a 3-hour drive that would cost them a tank of gas they didn't have, for an appointment that might tell them nothing they didn't already know. Bill's veterans benefits helped with some medical costs, but the bureaucracy moved slower than Montana winters, and there were always forms to fill out, appeals to file, and months of waiting for answers that might never come. 42 years we've made it work, Martha," Bill said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of bills that seemed to grow taller each week. "We're not starting to fail now." His voice carried the same determined edge he'd used when talking about expanding the herd in better times, or when defending his decision to stay on the ranch after Tommy's death. But Martha could see the cracks forming in his armor of confidence. The way he rubbed his leg absently during conversations, the slight catch in his breathing when he thought no one was looking, the increasing frequency of his late-night wanderings through the house. The burning sensation in his calf had grown from an occasional annoyance to a constant companion, like having a small coal pressed against his skin that never quite cooled. One night in late March, Martha woke to find his side of the bed empty. She found him standing in the barn doorway at 3 in the morning, staring up at the star-filled Montana sky with an expression she recognized from their son's teenage years, the look of someone wrestling with problems too big for words. "You know, Tommy used to do that when something was bothering him," she said softly, joining him in the doorway. The night air carried the familiar scents of hay and cattle, comforting smells that had defined their life together. For the first time in weeks, Bill's careful composure slipped. "Pain's getting worse, Martha. Feels like someone's driving nails into my leg and it's spreading upward." I can't work the ranch the way I need to, can't provide for us the way a man should." Martha slipped her hand into his, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of their decades together. "We'll figure it out, Bill. We always do." But even as she spoke the words, Martha felt the weight of uncertainty settling over them like an early frost. In a community where independence was valued above almost everything else, admitting weakness felt like admitting defeat. The Thompsons had always been the family others turned to in times of trouble, not the ones who needed help themselves. That night, as they finally returned to bed, neither of them mentioned the obvious truth. Whatever was happening to Bill's leg was beyond their ability to ignore or endure alone. The night that changed everything began like countless others before it. Martha Thompson had fallen asleep to the familiar sounds of her husband's restless movements beside her, the soft rustle of sheets as he searched for a comfortable position that his aching leg would allow. But at 2:30 a.m., she woke to something that made her blood run cold. Bill's right leg was moving violently, jerking and twitching with spasms so severe the entire mattress shook. What terrified her most was that Bill remained completely unconscious, his face peaceful and unaware while his leg performed its grotesque dance beneath the quilted comforter her grandmother had sewn 60 years ago. Martha lay frozen, watching in horror as her husband's limb seemed to have developed a mind of its own, convulsing with movements that defied every understanding of the man she'd shared a bed with for 42 years. The episode lasted 12 minutes by the bedside clock, though it felt like hours. When Bill's leg finally stilled, Martha remained wide awake until dawn, studying his sleeping face and wondering what demon had taken residence in their bedroom. In 42 years of marriage, through Vietnam nightmares and ranch accidents, pneumonia and broken bones, she had never seen her husband look so utterly helpless. The morning brought its own cruel normalcy. Bill woke with no memory of the night's events, stretching and yawning as if nothing had happened. When Martha gently mentioned what she'd witnessed, his reaction was swift and dismissive. "Must have been dreamin', darlin'. You know how your imagination runs wild when you're worried about something." But Martha caught the flash of fear in his eyes before he turned away to pull on his work clothes. The conversation that followed became their first real fight in over a decade. Martha insisted they needed to see a doctor immediately, while Bill argued they couldn't afford to chase shadows and bad dreams. Their voices rose in the kitchen as coffee grew cold and the morning chores waited unfinished. "Your pride is going to kill you, Bill Thompson." Martha's voice cracked with frustration and terror. "I won't sit here and watch you suffer because you're too stubborn to admit you need help. My pride is what's kept this family together," Bill shot back, his fist hitting the kitchen table hard enough to make the salt and pepper shakers jump. "My pride put food on this table and kept a roof over our heads when everyone said we should give up and move to town." The silence that followed hung between them like a physical barrier. Bill immediately regretted his harsh tone, but the words couldn't be taken back. Martha turned to the kitchen window, her shoulders rigid with unshed tears, watching their few remaining cattle graze in pastures that seemed to grow emptier each season. The foreclosure notice arrived that same afternoon, delivered by a postal worker who couldn't meet their eyes. The official language was cold and impersonal, but the message was clear. They had 60 days to pay $23,000 in back taxes and penalties, or lose the ranch that had been in Martha's family for 4 generations. That evening, Martha made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. She walked into Glacier County Jewelry and Pawn, her great-grandmother's wedding ring sliding easily off her finger after decades of faithful wear. The ring had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless family crises, but it couldn't survive the modern reality of medical bills and property taxes. "This belonged to my great-grandmother," Martha told the shop owner, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. She wore it for 63 years before passing it down to my grandmother, who wore it for 51 years. My mother had it for 38 years, and I've worn it for 42. The man behind the counter, a kind-faced jeweler named Pete Carlson, who'd known the Thompson family for 20 years, examined the delicate rose gold band with professional care. "It's beautiful work, Mrs. Thompson. Hand-forged, probably 1890s. I can offer you $3,200 for it." Martha knew the ring was worth at least twice that amount. But she also knew Pete was offering what he could afford to pay, not what he could eventually sell it for. "That'll be fine, Pete. Thank you." She left the shop with an envelope full of cash and an empty place on her finger that felt like losing a piece of her soul. But as she drove home through the Montana countryside that had shaped her entire life, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of hope. Bill was waiting on the front porch when she pulled into the driveway, his weathered face creased with worry. He'd spent the afternoon checking the mailbox obsessively, knowing that more bad news usually came in official envelopes with return addresses they didn't want to see. When he saw Martha counting cash at the kitchen table, his eyes immediately went to her left hand. The absence of the ring hit him like a physical blow, bringing him to his knees beside her chair. "Martha, what have you done?" His voice was barely a whisper. "What needed doing?" She replied simply, not trusting herself to say more without breaking down completely. Bill gathered his wife in his arms, and for the first time since Vietnam, he wept without shame. 42 years, and you still surprise me," he managed through his tears. "But I can't let you sacrifice everything for my stubborn hide." That night, as they held each other in the darkness, Bill finally admitted the truth he'd been hiding. He'd been secretly meeting with real estate agents, exploring the possibility of selling the ranch to pay for medical treatment. Like Martha with her ring, he'd been prepared to sacrifice everything that mattered to save what mattered most. "Seems we're both ready to give up our treasures," Martha said softly. "Maybe it's time we started accepting that some battles are too big to fight alone." The following Monday morning found Bill and Martha Thompson sitting in the cramped waiting room of Dr. Harold Johnson's family practice, surrounded by faded magazines and the antiseptic smell that seemed to permeate every medical facility in rural Montana. Martha clutched the envelope of cash from her ring sale, while Bill stared at his hands, still struggling with the humiliation of needing help he couldn't afford. Dr. Johnson had been the Thompson family physician for over 15 years, a soft-spoken man in his early 60s who'd delivered half the babies in Glacier County and seen most of their parents into their final rest. His examination of Bill was thorough, but revealed nothing obvious. Reflexes normal, blood pressure slightly elevated from stress, but no apparent cause for the violent nighttime episodes Martha described. "Sounds like diabetic neuropathy to me," Dr. Johnson concluded, his pen scratching across a prescription pad. "Your family history shows some diabetes, Bill, and these symptoms fit the pattern. We'll start you on insulin and see if that helps with the nerve pain." The blood tests came back negative for diabetes, but Dr. Johnson remained convinced of his diagnosis. "Sometimes the early stages don't show up in standard tests," he explained, when Martha called with questions. "Let's continue the treatment and monitor his progress." For 3 weeks, Bill faithfully followed the insulin regimen, pricking his finger multiple times daily, while Martha tracked his blood sugar levels in a spiral notebook with the dedication of a scientist. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They were spending money they didn't have on medication for a disease he didn't have. While the real problem continued to worsen, the nighttime episodes became more frequent and violent. Martha moved to the guest bedroom for her own safety after Bill's thrashing leg caught her ribs during a particularly severe spasm. The isolation was almost worse than the fear. After 42 years of sharing a bed, sleeping alone felt like the first step toward losing him entirely. During the day, Martha began cleaning houses for wealthy families in Billings, driving the 60 miles each way to earn $15 an hour, scrubbing bathrooms and folding laundry. She told Bill she was visiting her sister, unable to bear the shame she'd see in his eyes if he knew his wife was working as a domestic servant to pay for his medical care. The physical toll was evident in her cracked hands and the new lines of exhaustion around her eyes. But Martha maintained her cheerful facade with the same determination that had carried her through Tommy's deployment and death. Each evening, she'd return home with forced enthusiasm, chattering about imaginary conversations with her sister, while Bill watched her with growing suspicion. The ranch, meanwhile, continued its slow decline. Without Bill's full physical capability, basic maintenance fell behind. Fence posts rotted, gates sagged, and the few remaining cattle scattered into neighboring properties with increasing frequency. Pastor Jim McKenzie organized work parties from the church, but the help felt like charity to Bill. Each offered hand a reminder of his failing strength. The mounting medical bills created their own crisis. The first specialist appointment with Dr. Johnson's referral would cost $400, not including additional tests. Medicare covered 60%, leaving them responsible for $160 they didn't have, plus travel expenses to Billings and potential follow-up visits. It was Pastor McKenzie who finally intervened, arriving unannounced on a Thursday evening with a casserole from his wife and an agenda he kept carefully hidden. A skilled pastor's intuition had picked up on the family's struggles through missed Sunday services and Martha's increasingly hollow responses to casual inquiries about Bill's health. "How's that leg treating you, Bill?" Pastor McKenzie asked over coffee, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with concern. "Getting by," Bill replied automatically, but the pastor had known him too long to accept such deflection. "Martha tells me you're seeing specialists now. That's good. Sometimes we need to swallow our pride and accept professional help." The words were carefully chosen, planted like seeds in conversation that seemed to flow naturally, but had been planned with pastoral precision. After the pastor left, Bill and Martha sat in unusual silence. Finally, Martha spoke the words that had been building pressure in her chest for weeks. "Jim mentioned the church has a medical emergency fund. Maybe we should—" "No." Bill's response was immediate and final. "Thompsons don't take charity. We never have, and we won't start now." But that night, as Martha listened to Bill's leg thrash against the guest room wall, she made her own decision about pride and survival. The next morning, she called Pastor McKenzie and accepted the church's help, knowing she'd have to tell Bill eventually, but unable to watch him suffer for the sake of dignity that was costing them everything. The appointment with Dr. Samuel Morrison at Glacier County Medical Center was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Pastor McKenzie had quietly arranged for the church fund to cover the costs, presenting it as a community medical scholarship rather than charity. The distinction was thin, but it allowed Bill to accept help without feeling like he was begging. Dr. Morrison's reputation preceded him. 30 years of surgical experience, Harvard Medical School education, and a professional demeanor that inspired confidence even in the most anxious patients. His office reflected his status, diplomas and awards covering one wall, medical journals stacked neatly on his desk, and an air of quiet competence that made complex medical problems seem manageable. The examination was more thorough than anything Dr. Johnson had performed. Dr. Morrison tested Bill's reflexes, muscle strength, and nerve responses with instruments that seemed almost futuristic compared to the basic tools they'd grown accustomed to. His questions were precise and methodical, covering everything from Bill's military service to his family medical history. "Mr. Thompson, I've been practicing medicine for 25 years," Dr. Morrison said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "I've seen a lot of unusual cases, but I'll be honest with you. Your symptoms don't fit any standard pattern I'm familiar with. The night episodes Mrs. Thompson describes, combined with the progression of pain and the negative blood work, suggest something more complex than diabetic neuropathy." Martha felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone finally acknowledged the severity of Bill's condition, terror at the implication that they were dealing with something beyond medical understanding. "What kind of tests are we talking about?" Bill asked, his practical nature focused on costs rather than diagnoses. "MRI scans, nerve conduction studies, possibly some blood work that goes beyond the standard panels," Dr. Morrison replied. "I won't lie to you, it's expensive, but there are programs available for veterans, and the hospital has payment plans." The mention of veteran benefits sparked hope in Bill's chest. He'd never fully explored his VA options, assuming that his service-related disabilities were limited to the obvious wounds he'd brought home from Vietnam. The possibility that his current condition might be connected to his military service opened doors he hadn't known existed. Over the next month, Bill underwent a battery of tests that revealed more questions than answers. The MRI showed no obvious abnormalities, nerve conduction studies were inconclusive, and specialized blood work ruled out most known neurological conditions. Each negative result was both reassuring and frustrating. Good news that eliminated serious diseases, bad news that left them no closer to understanding what was destroying Bill's leg. Dr. Morrison's initial confidence began to show cracks as test after test came back normal. During one appointment, Martha caught him studying Bill's file with the expression of someone confronting a puzzle that refused to be solved. "Doctor," Martha said quietly, "in all your years of practice, have you ever seen anything like this?" Dr. Morrison looked up from the file, his professional mask slipping slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, I'd be lying if I said I had, but that doesn't mean we're going to give up. Sometimes medicine is as much detective work as it is science." The financial strain of testing was enormous, even with veterans' benefits covering part of the costs. The church fund helped, but Martha could see the discomfort in Bill's eyes each time Pastor Mackenzie quietly mentioned another anonymous donation to cover their medical expenses. The community support was overwhelming and humbling, but it came with the heavy weight of obligation and the constant reminder of their dependence on others' charity. Meanwhile, Bill's condition continued to deteriorate. The nighttime episodes became so violent that Martha worried he might injure himself. She started sleeping on the couch outside their bedroom, close enough to help if needed, but safe from his involuntary movements. The days blurred together in a routine of medical appointments, insurance paperwork, and the increasingly difficult task of maintaining hope when every expert they consulted seemed as baffled as they were. It was during this period of mounting desperation that Dr. Morrison made an observation that would prove crucial. While reviewing Bill's military records for potential VA claims, he noticed repeated mentions of environmental exposure incidents during Bill's tour in Vietnam. The records were partially redacted, but they suggested exposure to chemical agents that the military was only beginning to understand. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Morrison said during their next appointment, "I want to explore the possibility that your current condition might be related to your service in Vietnam. There are emerging studies about delayed reactions to chemical exposures, and some of the symptoms match what you're experiencing." For the first time in months, Bill felt a spark of hope mixed with anger. Hope that there might finally be an explanation for his suffering. Anger that it had taken so long for anyone to consider his military service as a relevant factor in his current medical crisis. The morning of Bill Thompson's emergency surgery dawned gray and ominous over Glacier County Medical Center. as if the Montana sky itself sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Martha sat in the pre-operative waiting area, her weathered hands clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, watching her husband of 42 years being prepared for a procedure that Dr. Morrison had described as exploratory surgery of last resort. Bill's condition had deteriorated rapidly over the past week. The nighttime episodes had become so violent that he'd actually fractured his bed frame during one particularly severe spasm, and the pain had spread from his calf up through his entire leg. More alarming still, his vital signs had become increasingly unstable, blood pressure spiking dangerously high during episodes, heart rate climbing to levels that made the emergency room staff exchange worried glances. "Mrs. Thompson, Doctor," Morrison said quietly, settling into the plastic chair beside her. His usually confident demeanor showed cracks of uncertainty that did nothing to calm her nerves. "I want to be completely honest with you about what we're facing today. In 25 years of surgery, I've never encountered symptoms quite like your husband's. We're going in essentially blind, hoping to find some physical cause for these episodes." Martha nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Through the observation window, she could see Bill being wheeled toward the operating theater, his face pale but determined beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. They'd said their goodbyes an hour earlier, words that carried the weight of a lifetime together and the fear that it might not be enough time. "The risks?" she managed to ask, though she dreaded the answer. "Standard surgical risks, infection, bleeding, adverse reaction to anesthesia." "But Martha, Doctor." Morrison paused, using her first name for the first time in their months of acquaintance. "I have to tell you, we don't know what we're looking for. This could be anything from a deep tissue infection to—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the darker possibilities that medical training had taught him to consider. In the operating room, the surgical team assembled with the subdued efficiency of professionals preparing for the unknown. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the young resident assisting Dr. Morrison, had spent the previous evening researching similar cases in medical literature, finding frustratingly few comparable situations. Nurse Rebecca Washington, who had worked with Dr. Morrison for 15 years, prepared instruments with extra care, sensing her colleague's unusual tension. "Patient is William Thompson, 68-year-old male, presenting with unexplained neurological episodes and progressive leg pain, Doctor," Morrison announced to the room as Bill was positioned on the operating table. "We're performing exploratory surgery of the right calf to investigate possible foreign body or deep tissue abnormality." The anesthesia presented unexpected complications. Bill's military training seemed to fight the sedation, his body instinctively resisting the chemical attempt to render him unconscious. It took nearly twice the normal dosage to achieve the necessary depth of anesthesia, a development that added another layer of concern to an already complex situation. Dr. Morrison made the initial incision with practiced precision, revealing layers of muscle and tissue that appeared normal under surgical lighting. For the first few minutes, the procedure seemed routine: careful dissection through healthy-looking tissue, systematic exploration of the area where Bill reported the most intense pain. It was Dr. Rodriguez who first noticed the anomaly. "Dr. Morrison," she said quietly, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone encountering something outside her medical training. "There's some unusual resistance here, about 4 inches deep." Dr. Morrison adjusted his position, probe in hand, feeling for whatever had caught his assistant's attention. When his instrument made contact with the object, he felt it move slightly in response. Not the passive resistance of scar tissue or bone, but something that seemed to react to touch. "Forceps," he requested, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the quickening of his pulse. Nurse Rebecca handed him the surgical clamps with practiced efficiency, but even she seemed to sense that something unusual was developing. The first attempt to grasp whatever lay hidden in Bill's calf met with unexpected resistance. The object seemed to shift away from the surgical instruments, moving deeper into the tissue in a way that defied Dr. Morrison's understanding of anatomy. After several careful attempts, he managed to secure what felt like one end of something long and flexible. "Beginning extraction," Dr. Morrison announced, his voice steady, despite the unprecedented nature of what he was attempting. The surgical team leaned closer, professional curiosity overcoming their usual detached efficiency. The first few inches emerged slowly, revealing what appeared to be organic tissue, unlike anything in Dr. Morrison's extensive experience. The substance was pale, segmented, and unmistakably alive, contracting slightly in response to the surgical lights and air exposure. 6 inches extracted, Dr. Rodriguez reported, her voice climbing slightly in pitch as the implications of what they were seeing began to register. This wasn't a blood clot, tumor, or any other medical condition she'd studied in textbooks. Dr. Morrison continued the careful extraction, his hands working with the steady precision that had earned him his reputation, but internally his mind was racing through possibilities that made no medical sense. 12 inches, 18 inches, 2 feet. The thing kept coming, seemingly endless, emerging from Bill's leg like some nightmare made manifest. "My God," Nurse Rebecca whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. In 15 years of working with Dr. Morrison, she had never seen him look uncertain, but the expression on his face above his surgical mask was one of growing amazement and horror. At the 2-foot mark, Dr. Morrison's legendary composure finally began to crack. His hands, which had remained steady through countless emergency surgeries, began to tremble slightly as he realized they were dealing with something that challenged every principle of his medical training. The extraction continued with agonizing slowness. 2.5 feet. The surgical team worked in stunned silence, each member trying to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't a medical procedure anymore. It was an exploration into biological impossibility. When the creature finally emerged completely, measuring just over 26 inches in length, Dr. Morrison's 25-year streak of professional emotional control shattered like glass. "Good Lord," he breathed, his voice barely audible above the operating room's ambient sounds. "In 25 years of surgery, I've never seen anything like this." Nurse Rebecca, shocked by hearing emotion in Dr. Morrison's voice for the first time in their long professional relationship, nearly dropped the specimen container she was preparing. Dr. Rodriguez stood frozen, staring at the parasitic creature that writhed weakly in the surgical lights, its pale body marked with segments that spoke of a complexity no one in the room could begin to understand. The immediate medical priority was Bill's condition. With the parasite removed, his vital signs began to stabilize almost immediately, blood pressure dropping to normal ranges, heart rate settling into a steady rhythm that suggested his body was finally free from whatever torment had been tormenting it for months. "Get this to the lab immediately," Dr. Morrison instructed, his voice regaining some of its professional authority as he focused on closing the surgical site. "Full biological analysis, and I want it compared against every database we have access to. Also, contact the CDC. They need to know about this." The surgical closure took another hour, but Bill's recovery was remarkably smooth considering the trauma his body had endured. As the anesthesia wore off, his first conscious words were questions about Martha, his voice weak but clear in a way it hadn't been for months. Martha was allowed into the recovery room 20 minutes later, her face streaked with tears of relief and exhaustion. Bill's leg, heavily bandaged but finally still, represented the end of a nightmare that had consumed their lives for half a year. "How do you feel?" she asked, taking his hand in both of hers. "Like someone just lifted a truck off my chest," Bill replied, managing a weak smile. "What did they find, Martha?" Dr. Morrison looked like he'd seen a ghost. Martha glanced toward the hallway where Dr. Morrison was deep in conversation with hospital administrators and what appeared to be federal health officials who had arrived with surprising speed. "Something they've never seen before, honey. But it's out now. It's finally out." The euphoria of Bill's successful surgery lasted exactly 48 hours before the complications began cascading like dominoes in a carefully arranged disaster. What started as a routine post-operative infection spiraled into a medical crisis that pushed the Thompson family beyond the breaking point they thought they'd already reached. Dr. Morrison's worried face appeared in Bill's hospital room doorway on Thursday morning, carrying test results that would shatter any illusion of easy recovery. "Bill, Martha, we need to talk," he said quietly, closing the door behind him with the careful precision of someone delivering devastating news. The surgical site had become severely infected with a bacterial strain that seemed resistant to standard antibiotics. Bill's temperature had spiked to 104 degrees during the night, and his white blood cell count indicated his body was fighting a battle it might not win. The removal of the parasite had apparently compromised his immune system in ways no one had anticipated. "We're looking at extended hospitalization, possibly weeks," Dr. Morrison explained, his voice carrying the weight of professional concern and personal guilt. "The infection is aggressive, and we're having to try increasingly powerful antibiotics to get it under control. I won't lie to you. This is serious." Martha felt the room spin around her as the implications crashed over her like cold Montana rain. Extended hospitalization meant bills that would dwarf everything they'd already endured. The surgery alone had cost $47,000, of which their insurance covered less than 60%. Now they were looking at intensive care, specialist consultations, and experimental treatments that could easily double or triple their medical debt. The financial avalanche began within hours of Dr. Morrison's announcement. The hospital billing department, with the polite ruthlessness of modern healthcare administration, presented Martha with forms and payment plans that reduced her family's crisis to neat columns of numbers and payment schedules. Even with the church fund and veterans' benefits, they were facing bankruptcy that would strip away everything 4 generations of Thompsons had built. The final foreclosure notice arrived at the ranch while Martha maintained her vigil at Bill's bedside. Pastor Mackenzie drove the 30 minutes from town to deliver the news personally, finding Martha in the hospital cafeteria during one of her brief breaks from the intensive care unit. "Martha, honey, I hate to bring this to you now," Pastor Mackenzie said, settling into the plastic chair across from her untouched sandwich. "But the bank called the church this morning. They're moving forward with the foreclosure. Auction is set for next Friday." The ranch that had sheltered 5 generations of Martha's family would be sold to pay debts that had grown beyond any possibility of redemption. Everything from the farmhouse where she'd raised Tommy to the barn where Bill had taught their son to milk cows would disappear under the auctioneer's gavel, transformed from family legacy into liquidated assets. "How much would we need to stop it?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer would be impossible. $73,000, Pastor Mackenzie replied gently. "The medical bills, back taxes, and penalties. It might as well be $1 million, Martha. I'm sorry." The community response to the Thompson family's crisis revealed both the best and worst of small-town America. The initial outpouring of support was overwhelming. Church groups organized bake sales, local businesses donated proceeds from special events, and a GoFundMe page created by Tommy's high school classmates raised $18,000 in its first week. But charity fatigue set in quickly, and the reality of modern medical costs overwhelmed even the most generous community intentions. $18,000 seemed like a fortune to neighbors struggling with their own financial challenges, but it barely made a dent in the Thompson family's mounting debt. Worse still, the media attention brought unwanted scrutiny. Local news stations picked up the story of the mysterious parasite, and soon reporters were camping outside the hospital, pestering staff for details about Bill's condition and the creature that had been removed from his leg. Social media exploded with conspiracy theories and amateur medical diagnoses that turned the family's private medical crisis into public entertainment. Bill's response to learning about the foreclosure was devastating to witness. Already weakened by infection and powerful medications, he seemed to collapse inward when Martha finally told him they were losing the ranch. The man who had survived 2 tours in Vietnam and 47 years of hard ranching broke down completely, weeping with the raw despair of someone who'd fought every battle life could throw at him, only to lose the war anyway. "I should have died on that operating table," he whispered to Martha during one of his darkest moments. "At least then you'd have had the life insurance money and could have kept the ranch. Now I'm just a burden that's costing you everything we've ever worked for." Martha's own breaking point came the following Tuesday, when she found herself in the hospital bathroom at 3 in the morning, sobbing into paper towels while Bill fought for his life 20 feet away. The exhaustion was bone deep, weeks of hospital vigils, financial meetings with lawyers, and the constant stress of watching her husband slip further away from the strong man she'd married. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her that they'd finally found and removed the cause of Bill's suffering, only to discover that the cure might destroy them more completely than the disease ever could. The parasite had been conquered, but the medical system that saved Bill's life was now methodically dismantling everything else they held dear. Pastor Mackenzie found her there, having arrived for his daily visit to find Bill sleeping and Martha absent from her usual bedside vigil. His pastoral training had prepared him for many forms of human suffering, but the sight of Martha Thompson, pillar of the church community, woman who'd comforted countless others through their darkest hours, reduced to broken sobs in a hospital bathroom, left him temporarily speechless. "I can't do this anymore, Jim," Martha confessed, her voice raw from crying. "I've tried to be strong, tried to hold everything together, but I'm failing. Bill's dying, we're losing everything, and I don't know how to save any of it." The news that Bill had attempted suicide reached Martha through a phone call from Dr. Morrison at 6:47 a.m. on Wednesday morning. Bill had somehow accumulated enough pain medication to take a potentially fatal overdose, saved only by the vigilance of a night nurse who noticed his declining vital signs during routine checks. "He's stable now," Dr. Morrison assured her as she raced through hospital corridors toward the ICU. "But Martha, we need to face the reality that Bill's not just fighting a physical infection anymore. The psychological trauma of everything that's happened, losing the ranch, the medical bills, feeling responsible for your family's financial ruin, it's created a depression that's just as dangerous as any bacteria." When Martha was finally allowed to see him, Bill couldn't meet her eyes. The shame of his suicide attempt sat between them like a physical barrier, making conversation almost impossible. The man who had always been her rock, her source of strength through every crisis, had given up hope so completely that death seemed preferable to continuing to fight. "I'm tired, Martha," he finally whispered. "Tired of being the reason you're losing everything. Tired of being a burden instead of a provider. Maybe it would be better if I just stopped trying so hard to get better." The depth of his despair was more frightening than any medical complication they'd faced. This wasn't the temporary depression of someone dealing with illness. This was the soul-deep exhaustion of a man who'd lost his sense of purpose and worth. Outside Bill's room, Dr. Morrison pulled Martha aside for a conversation that would reshape their understanding of the entire situation. "Martha, I need to tell you something about that parasite we removed. The lab results are unprecedented. We're dealing with something that challenges everything we know about parasitology in North America." The implications were staggering. Bill's case had already attracted attention from the Centers for Disease Control, and preliminary research suggested they might be dealing with a previously unknown species, possibly connected to chemical exposures during the Vietnam War. If confirmed, Bill could become the center of a medical research study that might help thousands of other veterans, but only if he survived long enough to see it happen. "There's something else, Doctor," Morrison added quietly. "The hospital administration has been contacted by federal health agencies. If this parasite is what we think it might be, there could be significant research funding available, possibly even enough to cover Bill's medical expenses. But we need time to confirm the findings, and right now, time is something we're running out of." The call that changed everything came at 7:23 a.m. on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after Bill's suicide attempt. Martha was dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside his bed when Dr. Morrison burst through the door with an expression she'd never seen before, a mixture of excitement, disbelief, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "Martha, Bill, I need you both to sit down," Dr. Morrison said, then caught himself as he realized Bill was already lying in bed, still weak from his latest round of antibiotic treatments. "I've just gotten off the phone with Harvard Medical School, the CDC, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. What we found in Bill's leg, it's going to change everything." The parasite that had nearly destroyed Bill's life had been identified as a previously unknown species, one that appeared to be directly linked to chemical agent exposure during the Vietnam War. More importantly, the federal government had just approved a $2.3 million research grant to study similar cases, with Bill as the primary research subject. "What does that mean for us?" Martha asked, afraid to hope after so many crushing disappointments. "It means Bill becomes a paid research participant," Dr. Morrison explained, his voice carrying the wonder of someone witnessing medical history unfold. "Full medical expenses covered retroactively, plus a research stipend of $50,000. But that's just the beginning." The revelations came in rapid succession, each one more stunning than the last. Newly declassified documents from the Department of Defense confirmed that soldiers in Bill's unit had been exposed to experimental chemical agents during their tour in Vietnam. The government's liability was clear and undeniable, triggering immediate approval of veterans' benefits that had been delayed for decades. "The VA has approved full disability benefits, retroactive to your discharge date in 1972, Dr. Morrison continued, consulting a thick folder of official documents. "That's 53 years of back pay, Bill. They're calculating the exact amount, but preliminary estimates suggest around $180,000. Martha felt the room spin around her as the numbers registered. After months of drowning in debt, watching their family legacy slip away piece by piece, they were suddenly facing the possibility of financial salvation that seemed too good to be real. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Dr. Morrison's voice dropped to a more serious tone as he delivered news that would transform their understanding of everything they'd endured. "There's more. A class action lawsuit was filed this morning against several chemical companies that manufactured the agents used in Vietnam. Based on the evidence from Bill's case, the legal team believes it could result in one of the largest veterans' compensation settlements in history. Bill, you're not just a victim. You're the key witness that could help thousands of other veterans get the help they've been denied for decades." The transformation in Bill was immediate and profound. For the first time since his suicide attempt, Martha saw a spark of purpose return to his eyes. The man who had felt like a burden, whose suffering had seemed meaningless, suddenly discovered that his ordeal might serve a greater cause. "You're telling me that this nightmare we've been living through could actually help other veterans?" Bill asked, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "More than that," Dr. Morrison replied. "Your case is being studied by medical researchers at 5 major universities. The parasite we removed has characteristics that could lead to breakthrough treatments for various neurological conditions. Bill, your suffering is going to advance medical science in ways we're only beginning to understand." The community response to the news was overwhelming. The same neighbors who had quietly whispered about the Thompson family's troubles now rallied with renewed enthusiasm, organizing celebration dinners and expressing pride that their community had contributed to a medical breakthrough of national significance. Pastor Mackenzie arrived at the hospital within hours of the announcement, carrying news that completed the circle of redemption the family had desperately needed. "Martha, I've got something that belongs to you," he said with a mysterious smile, reaching into his jacket pocket. The rose-gold wedding ring that emerged from his hand was identical to the one Martha had sold months earlier, down to the intricate engraving her great-grandmother had commissioned in 1890. But this wasn't her original ring. It was an exact replica, commissioned and paid for by the entire community of Glacier County. "Everyone contributed," Pastor Mackenzie explained, as Martha stared at the ring through tears. "The bank president, the grocery store owner, even kids from the elementary school where you used to teach. When word got out about what you'd sacrificed, the whole community decided your ring needed to come home." The gesture broke down the last of Martha's emotional barriers. After months of maintaining strength for everyone around her, she finally allowed herself to grieve everything they'd lost and celebrate everything they'd found. The ring slid onto her finger as if it had never left, and for the first time in nearly a year, Martha felt like herself again. Dr. Morrison's own transformation was equally remarkable. The surgeon who had built his reputation on emotional detachment found himself deeply invested in the Thompson family's recovery, both medical and personal. "I want to be completely honest with you both," he said during one of Bill's final hospital visits. "What happened in that operating room changed me as a doctor and as a person. I've been practicing medicine for 25 years, but I never understood the human cost of illness until I watched your family fight for survival." The hospital administration, initially focused solely on collecting payment for Bill's care, had shifted their approach entirely once the federal funding was confirmed. Not only were all existing bills forgiven, but the medical center announced plans to establish the Thompson Veterans Medical Research Foundation with Dr. Morrison as its director and Bill and Martha as founding board members. Nurse Rebecca Washington, who had witnessed Martha's quiet desperation during the darkest days, was promoted to head of patient advocacy, a new position created specifically to ensure that no family would face the same financial devastation the Thompsons had endured. "You showed me what real strength looks like," she told Martha during their final meeting. "Everything that happens from here forward will be shaped by what I learned watching you fight for your husband." The media attention, which had initially felt intrusive and exploitative, transformed into something positive as the true significance of Bill's case became clear. National news programs featured the Thompson family as an example of veterans' resilience and the importance of supporting military families facing medical crises. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Bill himself. The man who had attempted suicide just weeks earlier now spoke passionately about living long enough to see other veterans get the help they deserved. His depression hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced by a sense of purpose that gave meaning to everything he'd suffered. "I spent 50 years thinking my war was over," Bill told a reporter from 60 Minutes during a feature story about his case. "Turns out I've been fighting the most important battle of my life, and I didn't even know it." Every day I survived with that thing in my leg was another day closer to helping thousands of other veterans who are fighting the same fight. The financial transformation was staggering in its completeness. Not only were their medical debts eliminated, but the combination of VA back pay, research stipends, and legal settlement funds provided security beyond anything they'd imagined possible. The ranch that had seemed lost forever was not only saved, but could now be expanded and modernized. More importantly, the Thompson family had discovered reserves of strength they hadn't known they possessed. Martha's quiet heroism in selling her ring had inspired an entire community to examine their own capacity for sacrifice. Bill's willingness to become a medical guinea pig for the benefit of other veterans had transformed his suffering from personal tragedy into public service. The creature that had terrorized their nights and nearly destroyed their lives became the key that unlocked doors they'd never dreamed existed. Medical researchers studying the parasite were making discoveries that could benefit millions of people worldwide. Bill's case had already led to improved screening procedures for Vietnam veterans and new treatment protocols for previously undiagnosed conditions. As Bill's physical recovery accelerated, Martha began planning their return to normal life with the understanding that normal would never be the same. They had endured the ultimate test of their marriage, their community, and their faith, emerging with deeper appreciation for everything they'd taken for granted before the nightmare began. 6 months after the surgery that had changed their lives forever, Bill and Martha Thompson sat on the porch of their new ranch house, watching the Montana sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed more beautiful than either of them remembered. The 300-acre spread they'd purchased with their VA settlement was larger than their old property, but more importantly, it was designed for their new reality. Wheelchair-accessible ramps, a medical suite for Bill's ongoing treatments, and a guest house for the visiting researchers who had become part of their extended family. Bill's recovery had exceeded every medical prediction. Not only had his leg healed completely, but his overall health had improved dramatically once the parasite was removed. The constant pain that had defined his existence for months was now just a memory, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing his suffering had meaning beyond his own experience. "Hard to believe it's been less than a year since this all started," Martha said, her great-grandmother's ring catching the evening light as she reached for Bill's hand. The replica ring had become even more precious than the original, representing not just family history, but community love that had sustained them through their darkest hours. The Thompson Veterans Medical Research Foundation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What started as a simple research grant had evolved into a comprehensive treatment center serving veterans throughout the Northwest. Dr. Morrison, now the Foundation's director, had helped establish satellite clinics in 3 states, all focused on identifying and treating delayed reaction conditions related to military service. "Dr. Morrison called this afternoon," Bill said, settling deeper into his chair as the evening breeze carried the familiar scents of cattle and hay. "They've identified 17 more cases similar to mine, all Vietnam veterans. The treatment protocol we developed is working for most of them." Each success story felt personal to Bill and Martha. Every veteran who found relief from mysterious symptoms, every family that avoided the financial devastation they'd endured, represented validation that their ordeal had served a greater purpose. The Foundation's patient advocacy program, headed by Nurse Rebecca Washington, had helped dozens of families navigate the complex medical and financial challenges of serious illness. The legal settlement from the class action lawsuit had been even more significant than anticipated. The chemical companies responsible for the experimental agents used in Vietnam had agreed to a $2.8 billion settlement, with Bill's case serving as the cornerstone evidence. His willingness to testify, despite the painful memories it required him to revisit, had helped secure compensation for over 15,000 veterans and their families. "Pastor Mackenzie stopped by while you were napping," Martha said, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Tommy's children, now teenagers, spent their summers at the ranch, finally old enough to understand the significance of their grandfather's sacrifice. The church is naming their new medical ministry fund after us. Can you imagine that? The community that had sustained them through crisis continued to celebrate their recovery. Glacier County had become something of a medical tourism destination, with families traveling from across the country to seek treatment at the Foundation's clinic. The economic impact had revitalized the small town, creating jobs and bringing national recognition to a community that had always taken care of its own. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation had been in their marriage. The crisis that could have destroyed them had instead revealed depths of love and commitment they hadn't fully appreciated during their easier years. Martha's quiet heroism in selling her ring had become legendary in their community, while Bill's courage in facing medical uncertainty had inspired countless other veterans to seek help for conditions they'd been suffering in silence. "You know what I realized today?" Bill said, watching his granddaughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "All those years I thought my war was over. I was wrong. The real battle was just beginning, and it took 50 years for me to understand what I was fighting for." Dr. Morrison joined them on the porch, arriving for his weekly dinner visit that had become as much personal tradition as professional obligation. His own transformation from emotionally distant surgeon to passionate advocate had been one of the unexpected benefits of Bill's case. The man who had broken his 25-year streak of professional detachment had discovered that caring deeply about his patients made him a better doctor, not a weaker one. The Harvard team published their findings today, Dr. Morrison announced, settling into the chair Martha kept ready for his visits. "Bill, your case is officially in medical textbooks now. Students will be learning about parasitic infections and delayed military exposure reactions using your story as a primary example." The immortality of helping others learn from his experience appealed to Bill's sense of legacy. Having lost their son in military service, he and Martha had struggled with questions about meaning and continuity. Now they understood that some legacies weren't measured in bloodlines, but in the lives touched and improved through shared struggle. The financial security they'd achieved was almost overwhelming for people who had spent months facing bankruptcy. The combination of VA benefits, research payments, and legal settlements had provided them with resources beyond anything they'd imagined possible. But more important than the money was the knowledge that they'd use their ordeal to create lasting change. "Remember when you told me that Thompsons don't take charity?" Martha asked with a smile that held 43 years of shared history. "Look at us now. We've become the charity, helping other families avoid what we went through." As the last light faded from the Montana sky, their nearest neighbors began arriving for the weekly community barbecue that had become tradition since Bill's recovery. These gatherings weren't just social events, but celebrations of the bonds forged during crisis, reminders that in small communities, everyone's struggles become everyone's victories. The American flag that flew from their front porch had been a gift from the local VFW post, presented during a ceremony honoring Bill's contribution to veterans' health care. But it represented more than patriotic gratitude. It symbolized the complex relationship between individual sacrifice and collective responsibility that had defined their entire experience. "Thought we were fighting alone," Bill said softly, echoing words that had become his signature phrase during speaking engagements across the country. "Turns out I had an army all along." Martha squeezed his hand as their community gathered around them, friends and neighbors who had become family through shared trials and triumphs. The parasite that had nearly destroyed their lives had instead revealed the strength of connections they'd never fully appreciated. "We always did, honey," Martha replied, watching Pastor Mackenzie help their granddaughter light sparklers in the gathering darkness. "Sometimes it just takes a crisis to see it clearly." Above them, the Montana stars emerged in their ancient patterns, witnessing another chapter in the ongoing story of human resilience, community support, and the unexpected ways that suffering can transform into service. The Thompson family had learned that sometimes the deepest pain leads to the greatest purpose, and that healing often comes not from forgetting hardship, but from using it to help others find their own path through darkness. At 68, Bill Thompson thought his war was over, but life had one final battle waiting, one that nearly cost him everything he'd built over 4 decades of marriage. When mysterious pain invaded his leg and medical bills threatened to steal the ranch that had sheltered 5 generations, Bill and Martha faced a choice that confronts so many American families: surrender their dignity or lose everything they'd worked for. Martha sold her great-grandmother's wedding ring, a family treasure that had survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars, just to afford a doctor's visit. Bill, the Marine who'd survived Vietnam, broke down completely when he realized his wife's sacrifice. But sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest purpose. That parasite in Bill's leg wasn't just destroying his body, it was the key to helping thousands of forgotten veterans finally get the care they deserved. The couple who thought they were fighting alone discovered they had an army of neighbors, friends, and fellow Americans ready to stand with them. Martha got her ring back, Bill found his mission, and their community learned that true strength isn't about never needing help. It's about having the courage to accept it and pass it forward. What family treasure would you sacrifice to save someone you love? Have you ever discovered that your greatest struggle became your most meaningful purpose? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.